Okay, this is a little bit of Lawrence County, Indiana history today. This is the Clampitt Site out here in front of us. This is archaeological site number 12Lr329, which is just southeast of Bedford in Lawrence County, Indiana. A lot of people hear site numbers, they don't know what they mean. The site number, the first part is the state. So alphabetically, Indiana is the 12th state, so that's your 12. The letters are the county designation, so Lawrence County, the abbreviation is LR. And then the site number is the order in which the site was recorded. So in this case, this would be the 329th site recorded in Lawrence County, Indiana. So Clampitt Site is site 12Lr329. This site is on the National Register of Historic Places. It went on the register in March of 2016. So it's a pretty significant site. It's been known for well over 100 years to local people, and it had a couple of large excavations done in the early 1990s. We are looking facing north right now, and that ridge in front of us is the main part of the Clampitt site. That was where the village was at that I will discuss in a minute. And the site itself actually extends outward across some of these other ridges, but the main part of the site was just about an acre right up there on top of that ridge. This is a very sandy soil. You can't see that now. The site's in thick grass, which helps protect it from eroding away, so that's a good thing. But this is very sandy soil, which is one of the reasons why people chose it. It was easy to farm. It was easy to build things in. It was easy to dig holes to bury things, and it was well drained, so you didn't get all muddy or just have water standing after a big rain. And it's just up out of the floodplain. There's a creek just on the other side of the site, and the river is not far off to the west. So they were near to large water sources for drinking water, for transportation, for all kinds of things. You got to remember, waterways were the highways of prehistory, so being on a creek and a river like this would be like being at the intersection of an interstate and a state highway, or probably in this case more like the river was a state highway and the creek would be a county road. But still, it's a place where a lot of people traveled, so they interacted with other people, traded, and as a good way to move quickly. You could hop in a canoe and be downstream, especially if the water was up, very quickly. So it's just a perfect location for people to live. And the fact that it is a perfect location for people to live is why this is what we call a multi-component site, which means they didn't just live here during one time period. This site was occupied more or less continuously. I'm sure there were breaks in there, but people from every time period, from the Paleo-Indian period, which was at the end of the last ice age, all the way up until the terminal late woodland period, which was just before Europeans got to America, lived on this site. There have been, and what's unique about this site, there have been at least a dozen paleo points found here. Paleo points, as I mentioned, were from the end of the last ice age, so you can imagine there were probably still some megafauna like mastodons, mammoths, maybe saber-toothed cats, cave bears, giant armadillos, camels, horses, things that we don't see in North America today, and larger than what we see today, were living in this area then when these first people got here. Usually in Indiana, when you find a site with a paleo point, it's just one point, an isolated find. Occasionally there might be one or two, but to have a site with a dozen or so points that have come off of it is pretty unique. And then every other time period, all through the early, middle, and late Archaic, and through the early, middle, and late and terminal woodland, emergent Mississippian, people lived here. So in addition to the paleo points, the next most common component, and probably maybe actually more common than the paleo points, is the Riverton occupation, which those would be Merriam Trimble points. Also, people call them bird points. And those would go back to the terminal late Archaic period. And believe it or not, as tiny as they were not actually arrow points. They predated the bow and arrow by quite some time. There's been a lot of speculation as to exactly what the little bitty points were used for. But there is a huge Riverton occupation of Merriam Trimble points on this site from the terminal late Archaic. The period of time that was most interesting to archaeologists was the terminal late woodland period. So in that period, people were beginning to farm. They were horticulturalists. They were growing things like maize and beans and corn and probably tobacco, since some pipes have been found here, clay pipes. And they were also doing a lot of foraging and hunting, so they hadn't completely turned over to the farming and highly structured civilization of the Mississippian period, which came later, but they were just a step behind that as far as how civilization develops. I don't know if that's a step ahead or a step back, honestly. Sometimes I think we cause more problems the more civilized we allegedly get. But anyway, that was the time period they lived here. So they had small farming fields around here, and they were also doing a lot of hunting and fishing and gathering in the local woods. As far as the history being recorded of this site, it is first mentioned in a geological survey in the late 1800s as being a bone bank, which means that at some point on this site there was a burial ground. Apparently in the early 1800s or mid 1800s some floods came through and washed some bones out. Now there's no sign of anything like that on the surface, but at that time apparently there were, and that was the only mention of it. The next mention of it in the literature was in 1924 in a report which was the first county archaeological survey done in the state of Indiana, and it was done in Lawrence County by a guy named E.Y. Guernsey, who was also a state congressman, amateur archaeologist, and he was kind of one of the founding archaeologists in the state. He worked closely with Eli Lilly and Glenn Black to try to learn about the prehistory of the state of Indiana. Interestingly enough, Guernsey had a cabin at what's called Duncan's Bend, which is just down the river a piece, right over there. So he kind of grew up in this area. But this site is mentioned by him, and he mentions it primarily as having a lot of pottery on the ground. There were ceramics that came off this site, which is classic for the late woodland period, and that was what he mentioned about the site. He also mentioned it again in the early 1940s in a report about paleo points, and mentioned that a number of the concave base fluted points had been found on this site and on the surrounding sites, you know, within a half mile or so of here. So this was kind of a hot area, as I mentioned earlier, for paleo indent points. Then later, some collectors showed their collections to some archaeologists at IU, and then in about 1990, archaeologist named Brian Redmond, who was finishing up his PhD or had just finished it, I can't remember which, at IU, became very interested in the Oliver phase. Oliver phase is a terminal woodland period occupation, and it was named after a site near Indianapolis on the west fork of the White River. We're near the east fork of the White River down here, but it was marked by people living in stockaded villages, doing some farming, as I mentioned earlier, and also having a distinctive type of ceramics. Ceramics with these curved lines in them that are named after a French word called guilloche, which is just the motif of the lines, and just other traits of the pottery that made them unique. And so he found out that there were, not just on the west fork, there were some Oliver phase sites down here on the east fork by Bedford, and on down into Martin County and over in Orange County, and just, you know, throughout this part of the state. So he became interested. As a result of his interest, in 1991 and 1992, Indiana University did their field schools in archaeology on this site. And what they found was pretty amazing. You know, as far as things that a lot of people would be blown away by, like big spear points and things like that, there wasn't very much, honestly. But they still found tens of thousands of artifacts, meaning chips of stone, broken pieces of pottery, different things like that. They got some good radiocarbon dates, but most amazingly, they found that this village was surrounded by a stockade. So there was a stockaded wall that surrounded. I'm walking up to the peak of the Little Ridge, and basically this whole area I've walked is what was in the village. It was about 1 acre that was enclosed in the stockade, and there were posts. I'll put some pictures up. There were posts that went all the way around it, and a trench. So they built the trench, they set the posts in it, and they backfilled the trench with a lot of their garbage. So you'd find broken pottery, shells, burned materials from campfires and from cooking, all kinds of things like that in the trench. And the stockade went right out. The creek's over on the other side. They think there may have been an opening on that end, and then opening back here on the south end where we just came from. And the walls kind of overlapped, which could suggest two things. It could be that it had a double wall. It could be that it had an entrance with a double wall, as you might have seen in some of the old movies where there's a fort. So you kind of have like a chute that you go into to get into the entrance. It just gives an extra layer of security to keep people out, because you can have a double set of doors. Or it could be that the stockade was damaged and they had to rebuild it. Right here on the top part of the site, they found a large wooden post. The post obviously was gone, but the mold or the impression of it was left behind in the ground. And this post was larger in diameter and set much deeper than all the other posts. So you can imagine a village with a wall all the way around it here, of posts maybe anywhere from 6 to probably 10 feet tall, somewhere in that range. And then all of a sudden here in the center, you got a post that was maybe 12, 15, 20, or 30 feet tall. A lot of speculation as to what that might have been. Was it like some kind of a totem or a symbol? Was it something that had to do with the stars and things like that, and the sun and solstice? Or was it some other purpose? We really don't know. They never found any actual house structures, but what they did find was kind of a central open area that didn't have as many artifacts in the middle of the village, which makes sense. because most historic woodland Indian villages that were studied had an area like that for dancing and other ceremonies, and then the houses would have been around the perimeter. Unfortunately, they did not find any absolute definite houses. They did find some post modes that were probably buildings around, but they didn't find all the evidence they wanted. That's the case when you're dealing with something that's 700 years old or older. But this is the heart of the Clampitt Site. So this is a major part of the prehistory of Lawrence County, Indiana. A lot of people knew that Native American Indians lived here, but a lot of times they don't think that they're actually living in villages and had a fence around them and were farming and doing all the cool things that happened here. And what's really fascinating about this place, and you can kind of feel it when you're here, is people were drawn to it for thousands of years. It wasn't just the Oliver Phase people, but it was people, as I mentioned, all the way back to the end of the Ice Age. Every single time period, there are a number of artifacts that have been identified. So something about this place, which a lot of it's obvious, as I mentioned, the sandy soil, the creek, the river, just made it a fabulous place to live, and it's pretty cool place to this day. You just kind of get a feeling, you know, you'd be like, yeah, I could see myself living here. I totally understand why they lived here. There are some chert outcrops nearby. There's a lot of fossiliferous cherts, like the Harrodsburg, Allen's Creek, Haney type chert that comes out. And, you know, and it's not just here, it's all throughout Lawrence County. There are some other chert sources further west in the county of Bryantsville and Indian Creek chert. And there are also some Stanford chert outcrops, and you find a lot of all those types here, plus a lot of Wyandotte chert from down in Harrison and Crawford counties, the Ohio River. It was brought up here. You also find occasionally Burlington chert from Illinois, Flint Ridge chert or Chalcedony from Ohio. So there's just a whole variety. Holland chert from a little further southwest in Indiana, down close to Jasper. So there's a wide variety of chert. As I said, fortunately the ground is kind of protected now, so the site is not washing away or anything. And I might mention this site is on private property. It's posted and it is watched regularly, so wouldn't be a good idea to try to come out here. You probably get arrested, and that's for good reason. It's so, you know, nobody tears up or loots the site or anything. It's probably a waste of time trying to loot it anyway, because all the things IU dug, there was only 1 or 2 artifacts that most people would be interested in owning other than for the knowledge. So it's not like a lucrative site that someone would loot, but there was a wealth of information here. But they excavated out here. They basically followed the stockade trench all the way around. So they followed it kind of, I said circular, it's more like an oval shape. So imagine like an elliptical shape here on top of the ridge. And they also did some different test pits in different places. They also dug out on that ridge looking for the older components, because a couple Paleo-Indian and early archaic points have been found out there. So they're hoping maybe, based on the magnetometry they did, which is something that senses the well, I'm trying to think about how to explain it in the simplest way. It basically looks at the magnetic components of the soil and sees how they're oriented, and it can pick up if there's been a disturbance of soil, like if you've dug a pit or put a post in the ground or done anything like that. And there were some hits on the magnetometer out there, but unfortunately there was no radiocarbon datable material with any associated artifacts that could tell us anything. But anyway, just a really cool piece of Lawrence County history. Clampitt Site, excavated in 91, 92, on the National Register of Historic Places, and home to our ancestors, home to people for, you know, we've been here, our modern culture, for maybe 200 years in this area, and these people were here for maybe 10, 12,000 years. So really makes you think when you stop to think that I'm standing where people have stood and lived their lives for over 10,000 years. You know, they're not just historical figures, they're people like you and I. They had families, they fell in love, they had arguments, they had all the ups and downs and joys and letdowns of life that we all have. And they had it right here. And could you imagine, you know, if they could see the world today, it would be just unbelievable to them, I'm sure. And I would love to go back and see their world, because I'm sure in many ways that would be unbelievable to us. This is the very northern end of the Clampitt Site, and as you can see, it's kind of grown into an almost impenetrable thicket of Osage orange trees now. Ground's covered with Osage orange, the fruit off the Osage orange tree. But you can see you're quite an elevation above the creek. The creek is up right now almost to the top of bank level, so the water's a little bit high, and it would still have to come up another probably 12, 15 feet anyway to get to where we're at now, probably more than that. So you're pretty well protected from floods up here. It's not hard to imagine having 3 or 4 canoes parked right down there in the water, and you want to go somewhere and you just walk out of the gates of the village and hop in and take off down the creek and then down the river and go to wherever you want to go. One last kind of view of the site. Right out there is the main ridge in front of us where the village was located, and then they would have been farming in this area around here. I don't know how large a field. Probably at that time with the hand tools they're using, they had very small fields. Like I said, they hadn't gotten into the huge agriculture of the Mississippian period, where sites like Cahokia and Angel Mounds, they had acres and acres of cultivated fields. These guys probably just had an acre or two, and probably just lived here seasonally. Honestly, lived here, you know, to harvest their crops and everything, and then in the fall they may have dispersed up into the hills to gather hickory nuts and to hunt and things like that, and maybe come back from time to time. You know, we have a lot of theories, but that's the problem with archaeology. We never, until someone invents a time machine, we really never know if we're right. We have some pretty good ideas and theories, but they may be all bullcrap, and there's really no way of knowing for sure. But that's kind of what people speculate. Okay, I will also show some more artifacts that came from this site. And again, I want to mention one more time, this is private property, so, you know, please don't try to come out here. It would be a regret. But it's just cool to know there's, and this is not unique. There's it is unique that there's only one other site on the National Register of Historic Places from Lawrence County, and that's out at Bono. It was a Bono shell midden, a late archaic shell midden from about 5,000 years ago on a bluff top. But otherwise there are no other ones on the register. But there are a lot of sites that people don't know about of all time periods. And there were some other very similar sites from the terminal woodland period, from the Oliver phase like this, up and down the river. This is the only absolutely confirmed village that was found in the studies by Indiana University in the early 90s. But there are 2 or 3 places that are suspected as villages, and they did find what they thought were some small farmsteads where maybe 1 or 2 families lived and farmed. One is the Abner site, which as a crow flies is just about 1.5 miles around a bend of the river that way. Another one is the Pless site, which is a few more miles downstream to the southwest that way. And there were a number of other sites. So, you know, people, there's no place we walk where people haven't walked for thousands of years. This land was theirs long before we were here, and they knew it more. They're more familiar with it than we can ever hope to be. And the best we can do is try to respect it and carry on some of their traditions, and hopefully, you know, don't forget that they were here before us.